Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Talking Deals with David. Today, we're going to be talking about a subject near and dear to my heart, being an M&A lawyer, and we're going to be covering ESG considerations in M&A deals, and also how that links to rep and warranty insurance that we all know doing deals has really become, I think, ubiquitous in deal making the last 5 or 10 years at least. And I've got two great guests. You've seen us posting about this session over the last week. Christine Uri, you're joining us. Hi, Christine.
Hey, David. Thank you so
Hey.
much for having me on your show again. I always love a chance to talk with you.
Yeah, last time we were talking, I think, kind of high level about ESG and M&A deals, which was great. And then I think we were kicking around the idea about, well, how do you actually provide, protection for ESG related risk? And so I think the topic of rep and warranty insurance sort of naturally flowed from that. And to help us with that, Jennifer Tim, my partner, who's in Charleston, South Carolina, is also joining us. Hi, Jennifer.
Hey, David. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to finally make it onto one of your shows.
Yeah, it's awesome. And Jennifer and I, Christine, I don't know if I mentioned to you, but Jennifer and I, we work on maybe all of the deals that I'm involved in that have a rep and warranty component, which is a large number these days. And Jennifer has a really cool, background in insurance. And then kind of took that insurance coverage related background that she was doing and really kind of focused on rep and warranty insurance. So, and we'll talk a little bit about that because it's one of those insurance products that's really interesting to me as sort of a non-insurance lawyer because they're very bespoke. You can negotiate them and so Jennifer is involved kind of at the earliest stages where you're just thinking about placing a policy all the way through to, if after closing you have claims that you have to make. She's really helpful in working with the brokers and the insurers to provide coverage. So I think that mix of, Christine, your sort of expertise and focus on ESG and sustainability, and then Jennifer's focus on RWI, I think makes a great mix. So I appreciate both of you joining us.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great. So, Christine, I guess let me start off, I think, with you because maybe we could take sort of just follow up from where we left off on the last discussion and maybe give us a little bit of thoughts about, how you're seeing what ESG is, perhaps as just a general overview. And then we can layer in how that kind of comes up in the deal context and then in the RWI context.
Yeah, absolutely. So just starting with the basics, there's a lot of news and discussion around ESG that really doesn't capture what it actually is. ESG is a set of measurements for non-financial performance, specifically around environment, social causes, and governance, of course. So that's really what the term ESG means. But there are right now a lot of other components that are coming into that as you're seeing a mix of things. So you're seeing an increased regulation, a lot of regulation coming out in Europe if you're involved in cross-border deals. And then creeping up in the US, there's some state legislation. And of course, we all know about the pending or discussed SEC climate disclosure regulation. So lots happening in regulation. Lots are also playing into these environmental and social issues in terms of consumer and employee demand. So that's putting different pressure on corporations. And then finally, very interesting, at least for me and probably for you guys too, area is the activist litigation and how that's pushing corporate action. So there's this overarching umbrella of ESG as non-financial measures, and then you have these different factors that are compelling, I will say, companies to make different disclosures or take different actions in those areas.
Yeah, it's such an important part of M&A. I mean, I've been kind of focusing on thinking about it from the valuation side. And Christine, you and I have talked about that. How are ESG factors, good or bad, impacting selecting targets in deals? So sort of the deal sourcing, component, which often involves company corporate development team. But since it is such a large area, covering so many different functional areas within a company, it really, it can't be just one person or even a small group. It has to be, widely dispersed throughout the organization to bring to bear kind of the expertise and talents that you need to develop a really sound thesis. I love the way that I think it was originally Bain, the consulting company, that sort of had come up with the ways of looking at ESG and M&A, and I think they divided it between sort of ESG motivated transactions, which were those where some ESG factor was really the driver for the deal, versus ESG conscious type deal making, where it wasn't the driver per se. You were looking at more traditional deal drivers, finding new markets, new technologies, new people, synergies, all of the usual suspects, that you find in deal making, but where ESG was a important background consideration that went into sourcing deals and valuing deals. So that's a very interesting overlay. But where we're talking about today is, so what does that mean for doing deals, and how do you diligence ESG factors, which then ripple through into the reps and warranties that you find in an acquisition agreement? And then, Jennifer, now that reps and warranty insurance often is taking the place of a seller indemnity, sometimes completely, so that sellers are getting what I think we refer to in the M&A business as a clean exit, meaning that once they sell their company and get the purchase price, for most purposes, they're out. And if you have some legacy liability, some breach of a rep or warranty that comes up after closing, then the buyer's recourse is against this rep and warranty insurance policy, which is, as the name suggests, tied to the representations and warranties that a seller is making in a deal. So Jennifer, maybe just give us, like Christine did on the ESG side, a little overview of sort of where we are with the rep and warranty insurance market, and how rep and warranty insurance works at a high level, so everyone understands sort of the context that we're looking at.
Yeah, so the at a general level, the product, the insurance product, insures the reps and warranties made in the underlying acquisition agreement. So the idea would be that if there's a breach of one of those reps, then you could look then to the insurance carrier, the insurance policy for coverage, rather than your traditional indemnity or pursuing a seller. As you mentioned, these policies are all bespoke. They're all customized, which I think is unique in the insurance world, and also it really enables this product to work in the transaction. So there's an underwriting process, and each policy is underwritten and placed, and the coverage is determined through this underwriting process on a transaction by transaction basis. One of the reasons that I think that it has become a mainstay, and you've mentioned the clean exit and all of those other kind of the traditional reasons, or reasons that from a higher level. But if you look at the product itself, it has a longer indemnity or survival period than what you would traditionally get with a seller indemnity. I think traditionally you would get 12 months or 18 months survival, and in the policy you're looking at 3 years, 6 years for coverage. So I think there are some really great things about it that have made it kind of stick around in the market. The market itself has evolved quickly, and with the way that deals have deal flow, I guess. When we started, or when I started, there were just a few carriers out there willing to underwrite these policies, and now I don't know how many there are, more than 25, I would say. So it's really developed and hit its stride, and as you said, ubiquitous. I would say it's a mainstay at this point.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Christine, one thing you mentioned in a post you had yesterday, sort of as one of these stumpers, is how does RWI, how does that insurance link to ESG kind of factors? But the one important thing I think that Jennifer made clear there is it has to be linked to a particular inaccuracy in a representation warranty, essentially the same thing, in an acquisition agreement itself. So it does not provide insurance for occurrences like you might find in sort of a typical, CGL type policy or, property insurance or something else. It has to be tied to some type of representation and warranty that you have in the agreement. And so that then takes us back to what kind of representations and warranties that are ESG related are you seeing in acquisitions agreements? And then will insurers then provide coverage for that? And I guess what I'm seeing is, and you and I have talked about that, I'm not really seeing much movement at all in the M&A world to address specific ESG type risks or considerations in reps and warranties. Now, the reps and warranties always have covered lots of topics that fit within that umbrella of ESG. So there's lots of representations in acquisitions agreements about environmental compliance. There's many representations about labor and employment, which certainly falls under the ESG umbrella. And there's often lots of representations covering things like internal controls or governance standards, particularly in public company deals. But we haven't seen a move, at least I have not really seen, to incorporate other kinds of ESG targets or metrics into an M&A agreement. And I'm wondering, Christine, I'm wondering if a lot of that is because there really isn't much standardization, even in public companies in the US, let's take as an example, maybe a bit more in Europe, but there's really not a lot of standardization. And so it's quite difficult if you're going to propose certain representation to tie it to something that, is standardized, measurable, where the data is available. And I think that's why people have just sort of, pushed away from that for now.
Yeah. So what I'm wondering, and I emailed this question. What you're seeing, let's take it. I have a couple different subjects, but the big one that's on the table recently is climate and carbon disclosures. I'm seeing those all over the place with activist litigation, with pressure, with statements that companies are coming out with. So let's, and a lot of times still, at least in the US, they're voluntary statements. So you might come out with a statement saying, we'll be net zero by 2040, or what we're seeing now, and I pointed out the Delta case, would be we are carbon neutral today. So corporations are voluntarily coming out and making these statements. And the question, first of all, that I would have looking at that if I were acquiring a company that said it's carbon neutral is, okay, is that, have they done any homework? Did they actually get to be carbon neutral? You have to get a pretty good, a good measurement of your footprint. So did they do that work, and was it accurate, and are they accurately reporting what their carbon footprint is? And then if you're going to say you're carbon neutral, have you actually gone out and purchased the offsets? Is that legitimate? And at some point, if it gets, completely off the range, then you're into a fraud territory, which you probably have a representation about. But let's say there's a lot of just grayness in that there. So you have, you're acquiring a company, the company said it's carbon neutral, and then you end up finding out, either you find out, okay, that's not the case and we have to remediate somehow to make it true, or you end up in litigation anyway because the company hasn't done its homework, or you have customers who aren't buying in. So, I'm just wondering in that case, and you have it happen in different areas as well, in diversity, equity, and inclusion. You might have things around water, you might have things around waste, but all these ESG subjects where companies are voluntarily making these statements that could then either cost you a lot of money to make sure that they end up being true after acquisition, or land you in litigation if they turn out not to be true. So, my question to you, David, would be, if you have that situation, have you thought about, or could you go in and build reps that say, okay, we represent that in 2022 we were carbon neutral, and here's the definition of carbon neutral, and if that's not the case, then can you insure that?
Well, let me break it into two parts, and I'll defer on the insurability part to Jennifer. on the initial thing, sure, you could develop any kind of rep that you would like to see, whether or not a buyer in a seller in a competitive situation that we've seen in the last few years is willing to make such a rep, or with what disclosures or exceptions or qualifications. That's a different matter, and of course that would depend on various negotiating factors, including the parties' relative leverage and valuation in the deal, and how susceptible the seller is or willing to entertain that. So yes, you could certainly craft representations that target specific statements or policies or programs that a seller has decided to implement. And you could, I presume, much like you might do in an earnout, you could actually tie the valuation or contingent payments to either verifying certain of those milestones, targets have been met, or maybe even make them forward-looking a bit. Very much like you do in an earnout context, and you say, we will provide additional consideration if you achieve these milestones or these financial performance metrics. I could easily see that winding its way into the ESG context, particularly around climate change or net neutral type statements. But you typically don't make representations just generally on public disclosures that you've made, even really in the public context, because in the public deal context, you usually limit that to a universe of publicly filed statements that a public target might make with the SEC or some other governing body. But you wouldn't tie it to things like websites or sustainability reports, ESG reports, or press releases, or other kinds of more public-facing disclosures. So I think it'd be a very uphill battle. But as far as the insurability, Jennifer, let's say you were able to get such a rep in, so it's not tied to compliance with laws per se. It's tied to the company's own statements, goals, objectives, things that they have been talking about or reporting about. Is that something that, if you included such a rep in an acquisition agreement, do you expect that you would have coverage for that? Some pushback from the insurers on that? How do you think that would shake out during the underwriting process?
Yeah, so those are all good questions. And David, as you mentioned, we really haven't seen these specific reps being added yet. But I guess I've had a couple of different thoughts as y'all were talking through this. First, a lot of these statements that I have seen and observed are forward-looking and kind of aspirational. And those are things that aren't able to be insured under one of these policies. So, to the extent that it's not a verifiable, objective, measurable fact, there's not going to be, you shouldn't expect coverage. But on the other hand, if there's some way that this type of statement can be diligenced, and a buyer can confirm that it's true, then it would be something that I think that could be considered for insurance. I like to think that if that's the way the world is moving, that's what we'll see. That's how we'll see the policy respond as well. I mean, these policies have historically have evolved and kept pace with the market, and as things have become more commercial, these policies have reflected that. So, that's been my experience, and I guess we'll see. I think the biggest thing, though, that we'd have to really look at is how do you make sure that is indeed true?
Yeah, and Christine, because really in the underwriting process, what we find is, and by the way, just going back, Jennifer, what you said, it's a really great market. There's more insurers entering it, more competition among insurers. You're seeing much broader coverage than. I used to be sort of a big anti-RWI, person back when it first started, because, it was very expensive relative to the coverage. There was a lot of exclusions. It just didn't seem, and I think clients, bore that out. It wasn't that well received. But over time, as the insurance industry that underwrites RWI got much more, interested in responding to to deal lawyers and clients, it's become it's incredibly responsive type program. So they when there are issues that companies are seeing or lawyers like us are seeing, they're very responsive to those, and I think that's quite interesting. So I would definitely see more. I would see a willingness to go into those areas in the future, but I think, Christine, it has to be tied in some way to not forward-looking. They're not going to ensure future performance or future results, and I think it has to be just tied in some way to legal compliance, something that the company has to meet in order to fulfill its legal requirements, not something, as Jennifer said, that it aspirationally wants to meet or thinks it can meet. I think that's going to be very difficult to do. Or statements that you just can't diligence, like puffery, or we're an ESG conscious company, things like that. And I don't think that's going to be something that's coverable. But what are you seeing, Christine, in terms of the movement to having more actual compliance standards that are unified, that that we could point to in this area?
Well, a couple things, in a U.S. context, I'm curious, do you think it'll be a game changer for the reps and warranties if the SEC regulation goes through, which basically what the SEC regulation would require is a disclosure, and it's phased in for different sizes of companies in different years, but a disclosure of here's what your carbon footprint is. So you'd have to be putting out what your numbers are, and then also doing a disclosure of what your risks from climate change are. Now, that I think the risks part would be very hard to verify around, but in terms of, your carbon footprint is a scientifically measurable kind of fact. One, there is art, particularly when you get into scope 3 to it, that can be very confusing, but you should be able to figure out as a big company what your carbon footprint is from your energy usage, and that should be a fact. So those things are required from companies to disclose them, they're putting them in securities statements. Is that a game changer in terms of being able to include them in the reps or insure them?
I think that will absolutely help to contribute to more widespread acceptance in the deal community to having those kind of representations and warranties. What's interesting, though, Christine, and I think we've talked about this, you don't see representations and warranty insurance in public company deals. Very, very rarely. I've actually been a big proponent of using more RWI in public company deals, because traditionally and typically the way those deals are done, there is no indemnity at all. So it's a complete, public company deals are a complete buyer risk. There's no indemnity by the seller, which makes sense because typically, you've got a diffuse group of selling shareholders, and the market just doesn't allow for them to have any kind of post-closing indemnity. And on the other side, while insurers, I think, generally are open to and have insured in a few cases public company deals, there's some structural issues with the product and timing and how the reps work in a public company deal that make it much more challenging and less coverage than you would have in a private deal. So if those disclosure requirements are limited to, as in the SEC proposal, public companies, then no, I don't think it's going to change much, because you're not going to have RWI in most of those deals. There won't be insurance in most of those deals. And in the private company acquisitions, unless those requirements filter down and become legal requirements of larger private companies, I don't think that's going to come up. But Jennifer, what do you think of that kind of scenario that Christine lays out?
That makes sense to me. David, I know we talked about this quite a bit, the insurability of a public deal, and that has been a market evolution. We do see more of that now than what we used to, but I do think you'd have to see quite a bit of movement and trickle down before it really took hold. I mean, that's what I would expect based on other things that we've seen from the market.
Yeah, but the diligence side, Christine, is really the critical part. Like, for me, those are different things. you never want to go into a deal with the idea that you're going to be relying on indemnity claims, right? Whether that's, through a seller indemnity that's funded with an escrow, like we used to do deals, or whether it's, with something bespoke that, Jennifer negotiated on the RWI side. So when you have a deal where ESG considerations, either positive ones or avoiding risk, like you said, maybe the risk that there's going to be greenwashing claims after closing, or some reputational damage to you as the buyer if there's some massive consumer backlash as a result of some ESG factors. Those are critical to diligence upfront, early. And so I do think what has changed a bit is the diligence process that buyers undergo. I think it's more thorough in the last several years. I think it is more ESG centered focused. There's more questions directed on that at suppliers even. You're seeing more I know that's something near and dear to your heart, but there's much more diligence on supply chain diligence. Used to be you diligence the target, and that was it, and maybe the affiliates or something if you were buying a group or something. But you never diligenced third parties down a value chain or supply chain. That's become much more critical in deals, and in that area, you do have reps and do have coverage, perhaps because there might be legal compliance requirements at various levels that you could tag in an agreement, and presumably insurance companies would not necessarily exclude that as long as you did adequate diligence around it. But what do you think, Christine, in terms of buyers then focusing on the diligence aspect and some of these other things that we're talking about?
Oh, of course, it's always better if you know upfront. Leaving your carbon whatever problem to see, like, oh, we'll just cover that with the insurance and not look at whether they've actually done it is not a smart plan. So you start in that diligence phase. I am curious though, does this equation change if you go into a European context? Is the insurance a product that covers cross-border deals? And then, of course, in a European context, you see much more aggressive regulation even into private companies, and not really even particularly large private companies in terms of disclosures, climate, supply chain, that sort of thing.
Yeah, Jennifer, do you want to grab that? There are European coverages. I think they actually called a different name, Christine. So it's called warranty and indemnity insurance, W&I insurance, but functionally the same. Although historically it's been less expensive but less coverage. But I don't know, Jennifer, are you seeing any differences in the European context, given what Christine suggests, that there are more now legal requirements? So now you can link it to more specific compliance with law type provisions in Europe that do impact private companies, more than we're seeing on the U.S. side of deals.
Yeah, so I guess my experience would be, I've worked on cross-border deals, but we've been able to get a reps and warranties policy, a U.S. style policy, versus the warranty and indemnity policy, David, that you mentioned. And in that context, there is the diligence. You're working for a U.S. buyer maybe, and then you're having to retain specialists or diligence providers in those European countries to be able to look at these metrics and look at these European standards. So, it certainly is something that is being looked at. And I can't say, I don't think that I've seen an exclusion around those items in the last couple of cross-border transactions that I worked on. So I think that's a positive. I think that's good news. But certainly it is. There is a huge added cost on those deals when you have to add all of the service providers in these other countries to do all the diligence for you.
Yeah, we have actually a question from Eric, which I think ties in a little bit more on the environmental side, but it does give us a kind of an example. Yeah, Eric, you asked, how would this tie into phase 1, phase 2 that you do a lot of times in environmental representations when you're acquiring a company that it has significant environmental issues, and And yeah, this is a very interesting area. It used to be that any environmental reps, for the most part, would not be covered by RWI, or at least much more challenging, to get that coverage. And again, it makes sense because the insurers are not, they're not underwriters of environmental risk, which can easily become very large and also has more difficult parameters around it. But what I'm seeing is that you will be able to get coverage many times for environmental reps in an agreement, but you again, going to Jennifer's point, which I think underlays a lot of this RWI stuff, you have to be able to adequately diligence that. And I think, Jennifer, right, in most cases, they will want to see, the insurers will want to see that you have in fact done at least a phase 1 assessment of the target properties that would be subject to this coverage before they'll think about insuring it through the reps. And they'll usually then carve out as exclusions any recognized environmental conditions, what we refer to as RECs, or any specific sort of known issues that might arise. Because again, RWI is not meant to insure known risks; it's meant to insure unknown events that occur as a result of a breach of that. But Jennifer, what's your experience sort of on the environmental side, which obviously is a big component of the E in ESG?
Yeah, well, that's exactly it, David. So we've definitely, a few years ago, there were some underwriters who wouldn't even, if you had a deal that you're going to have some environmental issues to work around, you would avoid certain underwriters. And nowadays, I would say that you could go to the market and get a pretty equal position across the board, and that's going to be where we expect to see phase 1s, we expect to see adequate underlying insurance, and then you come back to them through the underwriting process with those diligence items, and then be able to carve out and really get very specific about the things that shouldn't be covered by an RWI policy, and maybe you can get covered by a pollution policy or by some other coverage, or get an indemnity, but you just that coverage wouldn't be available in the RWI context. And I have seen buyers, a lot of our clients, corporate clients, do like to get phase 2s just so they just have more information. But I've rarely seen, if at all, an RWI underwriter require a phase 2.
Yeah, it makes sense, because once you're into that category, then you're actually doing invasive testing, which most sellers are and buyers, to be honest, are tend not to want to do, because it's we refer to that in our business sort of as no dig type provisions, that you're not voluntarily going to undertake those sort of invasive testing unless you need to, as a result of some event or government government order. But yeah, the phase 1s, I think, are pretty routine now, where if you don't have that, you're probably just not going to get coverage, because on what basis can the insurers do the diligence that they need to assess whether or not those reps that are environmental related are true or not. It reminds me, though, and Christina, we were talking about this with Jennifer, it reminds me of the evolution a bit on the S component of ESG, when you started to see Me Too representations come up in acquisitions agreements, probably around, I forget if that's 2018 or 19, but in that time frame, you started to see that. And frankly, those representations are, in many cases, outside the pure compliance with law component, because they're broader than what you might find in the ordinary labor and employment representations that you would see in an acquisition agreement. So they did expand what the seller was repping to in acquisition agreements. And Jennifer and I were talking about that. I don't think insurers, they took a very pragmatic approach to that. And I don't think there was just a flat, we haven't seen that before, therefore we're going to exclude it. I think, again, they just came back on a pragmatic basis. Did you diligence it? How are you diligencing it? Did you take reasonable efforts to verify whether it was true or not? And generally, they've been covering those. So why not, why wouldn't that same approach apply as we see maybe some more specific ESG focused representations come into the agreement. I think it may well be the case that that's what happens.
Yeah. I mean, to me, if you have a company that's out there making specific public statements, and let's call it, not something, oh, we'll do this in 2030, but last year uh, our CO, our footprint was so many tons, and you're saying that in public, it seems to me like that is a measurable fact, and you should be able to get a representation of the accuracy of that. Now, in diligence, of course, you should check and see, hey, who did that calculation? What did you include? You should be, you should be asking those questions, but it's that to me seems like completely fair game for a rep. But you do this much more, of course, than I do.
Yeah, well, you'd have to have. I mean, no, there's not reps like that typically. I don't see those. I don't think Jennifer has seen those. In order to do that, I think what you would have to do is narrowly define what it is that the statements are. You might even have to like reference those. These are the particular statements that we've made. Reference those so that there's a clear universe of what those are. And maybe you could say something like, these are materially accurate, or something. You'd use sort of the rubric that you do in a rep relating to your public filings or something like that. These contain materially accurate assessments. And then I guess the question I would have for you, Christine, is how are companies doing that? Or if there's a third party who can come in and assess it like they do on the phase one, like we talked about, right? That's not the company themselves. That's usually a consultant that comes in, does some high level analysis of environmental conditions on the property and makes some assessments. Is there a comparable organization, group, consultants, people that would be able to come in and provide some independent verification to that? If so, I think that's something that arguably you might be able to convince the insurers to provide coverage for. But if not, I'm not so sure about that. I don't think they would cover that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have a verified carbon footprint, so we do carbon measurement for our clients. We do our own carbon measurement, but still take it out to a third party to get it verified. So that's absolutely a service that you can buy on the market today. I'm just thinking about this from an acquirer standpoint, and if I put in a rep that said, or asked for a rep that said, hey, the public statement you made on your carbon footprint is true. And they came back and said, no, we're not going to rep to that. That would be a huge red flag for me. I mean, that I would be like, oh, you're not going to rep to the fact that the public statement you made was true. And maybe you put some wiggle room around that in terms of, oh, we got this third party verified, statement or something like that. But, if I'm buying a company that's not willing to rep that its public statements are true, I'm going to think about that pretty hard.
Well, you should. No, you should. And one of the reasons why, Jennifer, I was mentioning to you that I've often said that if you're doing an acquisition agreement, you really only need maybe 4 reps. There are 4 reps that are really, really critical. And there are things like the agreement's been properly authorized, right? You have the power and capacity to actually enter into the agreement. That's obviously an important one. The financial statement rep. Our financial statements are accurate in all material respects. That subsumes a lot of historical, company performance information within that, within those GAAP level or even non-GAAP financial representations. And then you would have a rep that says there are no other liabilities other than those set forth in the financial statements. That's a pretty good rep and covers a lot of different, known and unknown type liabilities that the company may incur. And then a final one is the compliance with law, that we operate our business in compliance with law. If you have those 4, you've sort of covered a lot of the bases. But of course, we don't do that, and we have many, many more. And I think, Christine, one of the reasons is what you've said. It helps to focus a seller on particular things when you break that down. So when you take a compliance with law rep and you build 30 more pages of basically, subcomponents of that particular rep, it helps people to focus. So yes, if you ask for a rep like that, which again, I have not seen buyers asking for, but if you do put a rep like that in, I think it will certainly evoke some heated discussions around the propriety of that rep. But fundamentally, the question is it true? Or what you saying is true, and on what basis are you verifying it? And if you can't get it insured, it doesn't mean you can't have it as a rep. Or that you can't get indemnity for that. You may just need to negotiate a special indemnity from the seller for those particular reps, or maybe tie it, like I said, to some other value, criteria, where maybe the value of the company is discounted if that turns out to be false in some way, and you have some metric for for measuring it.
Yeah.
I think we do an alert or some sort of LinkedIn article maybe on what these reps would look like, and what, here are we can verify. Here's how you verify the carbon footprint, and here's how, Christine, we really need your input for this.
Right,
but
definitely.
These are the things, and these are the companies who value it, and this is how you do it. Just kind of I think it would be interesting to see what's out there that we could actually diligence and get reps to.
Yeah. You raise a good point on the focus, David, because from a compliance with law standpoint, if you wanted, that could cover, let's say, the company's made false statements about their sustainability performance. If it's a B2C company, that could well be a false advertising type claim, or a failure from either a state or a federal perspective. If they're making consumer-facing statements about their sustainability performance that aren't true, maybe that falls within a compliance with law from. I think it'd probably be difficult, but maybe it falls within that. But there's also, what is important to the buyer. David, based on this conversation, you probably would think it's crazy, but in late 2020, I was looking at an acquisition, and I wrote in a rep about compliance with the COVID regs at the time, because we were having such an issue figuring out. You remember there was all the Biden proposals around mandatory vaccination and all of this controversy that we were dealing with within our own company. And I didn't want to acquire a company that was going to add on to all the difficulties that we were having around that. So, and I didn't get any pushback. I slid that in, and it was very specific, and it was, I wouldn't try it today because it's not necessarily relevant. But at that time, that was a hot focus issue that was very niche and probably could have been covered by compliance with law. But I wanted to throw it on the table to see what the response would be.
Mm-hmm. That's great. No, it's a great idea, and I do think that one of the important things when you're doing deals is to really think about. That's why I always talk about making sure the lawyers are connected carefully with people like you, Christine, but also on the business, on the corporate development side, to really understand what is the motivation for this particular deal, how is it being valued, what are the core metrics, whether it's financial driven or some of these ESG considerations that we've talked about around carbon neutrality or other areas, and then make sure that you've not only diligenced those areas to your satisfaction, but also, if appropriate, to build in special reps. And sometimes that may require people to do like you did, which is to come up and actually invent something new, or come up with a new way of formulating it that hasn't been done before. And I think as long as you have a plausible rationale, if you can point to why that's significant in terms of how you valued the business, and you certainly can point to the seller's own, statements and positions on it, I would think that's going to be much more challenging to kind of push back on. And then whether or not the insurance companies, will step in and insure that is a different matter. But Jennifer, one of the things I love about the work that you do, and maybe for Christine or others that aren't as familiar with the RWI, it really covers that whole gamut, as I said. And what I like to do, Christine, with Jennifer, is you really get involved very early, because it's amazing the information that she has, for example, on all the different insurers, how they approach the underwriting process. Many are different, have different approaches, some a little more intense in areas than others. And then when you get the quotes back, the analysis back of who's willing to provide coverage, it can really range. Some will insure things that others put complete blanket exclusions for. And so there's a lot of like looking at these juggling. There's a plus here, a minus here, a plus here. And then of course the cost, may vary a little bit as well. But one of the things Jennifer is really good at is also giving you that sort of qualitative assessment. How easy are they to deal with? How friendly, how willing are they to do different things, explore different ideas, and then ultimately, what's their claims, history process? Are you likely to actually, get paid if you do have a claim? And all of those are part of it. And then rolled into that, she'll help to negotiate these policies, including narrowing exclusions, getting rid of exclusions, and there's lots of cool ways that to do that. But Jennifer, it's a very it's a very cool practice, and I think like in your area, it really developed from your interest in insurance, which I told you before is not. I wouldn't say that's like cool, but for you it was, because you love insurance. I mean, everybody. So you really fell in love with insurance, and then kind of built that practice around that, right?
Right. So I'm a litigator. Christine, that's what I grew up doing, is litigation. And so the M&A world was completely new to me. I knew insurance, I knew litigation, but not M&A. So, I think I read some people gave me some books to read, I read this in law school, you should read this, or, here's how you build an indemnification package or whatever. And just to kind of gone from there. I kind of feel like a pseudo M&A attorney sometimes, and have to remind myself and others. I frequently tell David like this: remember, I'm not a real M&A lawyer. Like you might want to check out what I'm saying about this concept or this thought here. But it has been really fun, and I think one of the, in the litigation world, we always looked at M&A attorneys as, they have a form and they're just changing out names and benchmarks or whatever. And couldn't have been more wrong. I mean, it has really been a great practice and experience, and I've really appreciated getting to work. I work with all over the United States, with attorneys all over all of our U.S. offices. I've had some experiences in other cross-border, but typically I only do reps and warranties insurance. So it's been great.
Yeah, it kind of combines your love of insurance with sort of this more, I guess, fast-paced M&A, kind of deal work. But Christine, I don't think I've ever asked you though, but how did you really get? We didn't cover that on our last session, but same thing. Like, how did you really become, so interested, focused on, sustainability more broadly, but ESG in particular, and really the love for sort of conveying that to in-house lawyers, but really everybody. I mean, I've gained a tremendous amount just reading, your postings and writings and podcasts and other things that you've done. But how was that sort of part of what you've decided to focus your professional work on?
So I joined a company in 2013 that was, the core business was around sustainability. So kind of early in, I would say. And then in the first couple of months, I was asked to join a team of mid-level leaders that were working on the company's internal sustainability strategy. So I'm in a sustainability company building our own personal sustainability strategy. And then I stayed involved with that, really for the last decade. I was responsible for it when I was an HR leader, and then I became the chief sustainability officer at the company. And I just had this tremendous opportunity to learn from all of our experts internally, because I leveraged our internal experts to put together our own program. And then I think it was 2021. I've been posting for a while now, but what I saw from my contacts and my other friends in the in-house world was more and more companies were just kind of tossing ESG at their in-house teams and say, hey, this is a new thing. Why don't you go do this with no budget and no help? Is kind of a favorite move of executive teams everywhere. So I thought, I have this wealth of knowledge and experience that have largely come from the industry that I'm in and the people I've had an opportunity to work with. How can I share that out to make it easier for other in-house counsel that are just getting started, that have just, don't have all of these experts that they get to tap onto, maybe don't have a huge budget, but know, hey, my company really has to take action on that. And then I would say in the last 6 to 9 months, it's really ratcheted up within in-house departments as you are seeing these new regulations that are happening, either on the horizon or coming into being, particularly in Europe, and then the SEC ones in the US. People are standing up, taking attention to that in ways, and realizing that it has to become part of what an in-house team handles. So I try to just put out little bits of knowledge that make it like, hey, here's, spend 3 minutes and you'll walk away with something that you need to know.
Well, it's great, Christine, because it is such a huge, area. In some ways, I think your description of that is kind of like, maybe Jennifer, when you were trying to get your arms around M&A. It's, it's such a, a broad topic covering so many different types of deals and structures and tax, and I mean, just all of it, which is why I love it. It's always something new. There's always, different personalities, different deal structures, different timing. All of those factors kind of converge to make it, at least a pretty exciting practice area to do. But it's a lot, and trying to figure out, where do I go? And I think, Christine, that's why people, I think, have loved, what you're doing, because you sort of take it and try to, break it down into little manageable pieces that when combined, it's a lot of stuff, but it gives people kind of a framework to how to approach things, even almost from day one, right? You've written some things about, like, what do I do,
Yeah,
when
exactly.
I know nothing and I'm just literally starting. What are the 4 or 5 things that I should start doing? And I think that's a great way to do it.
This is one of my, almost all of my, no matter where I'm at for in-house counsel, one of my first tips is always go out and read everything that your company's saying on these topics already, which is really key for prepping for a deal too. So I kind of do that diligence process. If you're going up for sale, you should know what your company's saying on this anyway, but it
Yeah.
could become very important.
Oh yeah, you're right. That's actually a great point. That one of the things I think I have seen a little bit in diligence is how diligence is almost like formulaic, but in a way it's not effective. You send out these massive checklists, which are kind of important because you don't know what you don't know, so you're not sure what you want to ask or not. So what happens is it just becomes like a barnacle, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the checklist goes to 20 page, and of course sellers then are angry and they're like, what is going, why am I getting this? But it's a checklist approach in many ways. And I think that, doing things like, well, let's just look on Google, or let's actually go and just check out, like, what is the company saying outside of its formal, press releases and things like that. Even what are their key employees saying, what's happening, on the web, what's happening in social media. Those are definitely areas that are much, I think people should diligence more, are diligencing a bit more, because it's amazing how catastrophic something like that, like you said, Christine, like whether it's a Delta thing or other things, it's amazing how catastrophic something viral, something social media can impact a company. And that is a risk that, for the most part, is just not covered in M&A indemnification, whether we're talking insurance or just straight seller indemnification. It's just not covered, and that can create a massive loss in value to the buyer. Not to mention, perhaps crushing their own, reputation. So it takes everything down if you do that. So figuring out, it's actually quite scary, but figuring out a way to manage those risks is pretty important for somebody like you, Christine, in house that has to be responsible for that.
I have a Google Analytics search set up on my own company. Just that, and I
Yeah.
have discovered things that way before too. It's, hopefully, if it's a big deal, you hear about it first. But sometimes people are out, they make a statement, it doesn't seem like a big deal. But yeah, if you're an in-house counsel, you should absolutely have a Google Analytics search set up on your own company.
Yeah. Well, Jennifer, I think you invited Christine. I think we have to do something, because I kind of caught there, right? That, maybe, Christine, there is an area there to explore a little bit more detail, but to think about, how would some of these reps look, maybe focused on what you're talking about, specific statements that you could identify, and what resources are available to diligence that, to kind of verify those statements. so that you could then, what, Jennifer, I guess that provides sort of like a package that you would then present to the insurer in a way, saying, look, here, we know we're having these reps, we know these are a little bit different, there's a reason why we want those in this particular deal, and here's the process by which we're going to diligence this and give you comfort that we've looked into these in a way that would allow you to insure them. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Ultimately, I think so. I think that my initial thought was just starting somewhere, because, David, neither one of us have really seen these in documents. Yeah. So what would that look? I mean, the first thought is, what does it look like? Is it actually a rep, or is it too forward looking? It sounds like, based on our conversation today, that you can get a rep or come up with a rep. So we come up with a rep, and then the thought of, how do you diligence it? So kind of a progression of what this might look like, and maybe we can use it in a deal sometime soon.
Test it out.
Yeah, and see, we can test it. We can just.
I think if you start with a company, from a buyer perspective, where the ESG factors are a real key part of their brand or their identity. So this is something, I come from a sustainability company where we do carbon services. And so am I going to be really interested in what the carbon statements are and footprint is of an acquisition? 100%. So those would be your kind of acquirers that would want to push the envelope a bit more on this.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's great, and I think insurers will be willing to entertain that as long as they can get their arms around what sort of methodology is used, how are you verifying it independently, and and as Jennifer said, can't be something forward looking. On the forward looking piece, though, I think we do have some good ideas, which is to use more incentives that you can structure in M&A, like earnouts, like other types of contingent payments or clawbacks. I guess you could take a more negative view and do it the opposite way. But those kind of approaches, I think, could easily be tied into ESG metrics, or even, Christine, like we've talked about, transitioning a business, integrating a business is such an important part of doing successful M&A, and I've tried, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to key earnouts and other kinds of contingent payments to transitional successes, milestones that key off of integration. And you could do that with ESG factors, whether it's a carbon reduction or other areas where you're trying to get quickly a target into an integrated way with what your approach is, and provide some incentives to doing that. So that's another maybe way to approach it outside the RWI.
This is coming into executive comp. So you're having, executives whose performance is being measured from a pocketbook standpoint based on their environmental performance, their carbon performance, these kind of factors. So, and to me, that makes it fair game for an earnout if your executive team is being measured on the same thing.
Yeah, definitely. No, it's definitely true. Well, this was where, I can't believe how fast this time goes. It's amazing. We've almost got an hour. I think we were targeting 45 minutes. It just went, it went on a little bit. But Christine, thank you so much for doing this times two, second time. I know we have always new topics, so maybe I can entice you to do another one. And Jennifer, I'm so happy that you agreed to kind of take a leap of faith. Try one of these crazy LinkedIn Live things with me, and you were terrific, and always enjoy working with you on deals too.
This was really fun. Really, really fun.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks Christine. Appreciate it. Thanks, Jennifer.
Bye.
Okay. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.